I would move to David Milson, who represents the New Zealand House of Representatives. And David would be talking about considering expedited parliamentary procedures to pass emergency legislation. You have got 10 minutes, David, and I request you to please kindly adhere to the time. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Shamoon, and well, good evening, everyone. It's Tuesday night here for me. It's a pleasure to be talking to you all. And following Bryn's global focus, I'm going to take a much narrower one on a small country in South Pacific, New Zealand. Just by way of background, our first case of COVID-19 was reported on the 28th of February of this year. The government put in place an alert level system, and on the 25th of March, we went into a 4-week nationwide lockdown. Before that happened, the Parliament took a variety of decisions to ensure that it could operate, not at full capacity, but effectively during the lockdown, because members of Parliament all agreed that they would observe the restrictions that applied to all other New Zealanders. So a small group of ministers stayed in Wellington, the capital, to manage the crisis, but most members of Parliament went home and sheltered in place like everybody else. So the House made a variety of temporary changes to its procedures so it could function under these restrictions. The restrictions lasted until the 8th of June, where we'd had about a month with no more cases of COVID-19, and then the restrictions were removed apart from border controls. There's been another small outbreak which caused one of our cities to be locked down, but basically there's 4 or 5 cases of COVID-19 in the country. So we're in quite a fortunate position, I think, having a small population, very little population density, and of course being an island, 2,000 kilometres away from our nearest neighbour. So we've been, I think, quite fortunate, but we still had to prepare for the pandemic and the lockdown very quickly, because events moved quickly and the government needed to act fast to safeguard the people. I think the key mechanism for us was our business committee, which is a cross-party parliamentary committee chaired by the Speaker. I'm an advisor to it as the Clerk of the House, and there are members of every party on it. It operates on a consensus basis and has all parties on it, and so it's become a real decision-making body for the Parliament, which has delegated more and more decision-making power to it. But it's also been a place that has experimented with new procedures, even in more settled times than we're in at the moment. And so it was in quite a good position to think about how we would address the restrictions under lockdown. And it was instrumental in setting up our Epidemic Response Committee, so a dedicated committee to oversee the government response to the pandemic. It was involved in the agreement that all the parties reached that the House wouldn't sit during the lockdown period. And the Epidemic Response Committee would stand in for Parliament effectively in scrutinising government activity. So shortly before the lockdown, the House sat and agreed some sessional orders, so some temporary changes to our standing orders, our rules of procedure. It passed some emergency legislation to empower the government to be able to take action effectively without having to refer to the Parliament all the time, and it passed an impressed supply bill to fund all of this as well, which has been supported by a significant amount of government borrowing. Once that was done, the House didn't sit for a month, and the Epidemic Response Committee really took the centre stage, I think. It was chaired by the Leader of the Opposition and had an opposition majority. Those have been very unusual things in New Zealand. Some chairs are opposition members, but the Leader of the Opposition wouldn't normally chair a committee, and the government usually ensures it has a majority on committees. But because the focus of this one was on scrutinising the actions of the government, they took a different approach. The committee met virtually over Zoom. It didn't ever meet in person because sessional orders had been put in place to permit that. And it focused its meetings on questioning ministers and senior public servants about the epidemic response. So the committee met every day that the House would normally sit, and it took its role quite seriously as being a substitute for the House as much as possible. It also considered very quickly some legislation related to COVID-19 and reported back to the House on that once the House was sitting again. But that committee was a really important focus, And the other interesting thing about it is it was watched by a lot of New Zealanders. We televised the meetings of the committee and webcast them as well. And about 1 in 6 New Zealanders watched it at some point, because they wanted news about what was happening, and also because they saw ministers being questioned for extended periods of time about what the government was doing. There were some other changes made as time progressed as well. Changes to our standing orders around how we voted in the House and the number of members that had to be present, so that when the House did start to sit again, it could keep some physical distancing in place. And a smaller number of members were able to travel to Wellington. Those who had to stay at home in their electorates could do that. But parties were able to cast all of the votes that they would normally cast. We also moved away from a lot of paper-based procedures to electronic ones for lodging of motions and papers and things like that. Things that would normally be done in person, we changed to make them virtual instead. And the business committee, as I say, was heavily involved in making these decisions, and it met every week online to make decisions. It made some other decisions about expediting legislation as well. So normally where legislation is referred to a committee, that's debated. They did away with those debates. There's normally also a delay between bills being reported from a parliamentary committee back to the House and them being able to be debated again. And they removed that in order to facilitate the legislation moving more quickly. And I think one of the key factors for us is that the opposition was supportive of the government's activities generally. Although they scrutinised them and criticised some things that they didn't think were very effective, generally they supported what it was doing. And one of the previous speakers has mentioned how that's important. It's not a political issue. So the House was quite cooperative in terms of facilitating the rapid passage of legislation around COVID-19, and parties also operated with a high degree of mutual trust. This could have been challenging because we have a general election in a few weeks, and so in election year there's a greater incentive for parties to differentiate themselves from each other, and of course for the opposition to try and become the government. But there was a high level of trust and cooperation, and so the House was often able to pass legislation very quickly, sometimes within a day, without having to take urgency or without having to do it against the will of the minority parties. But speedy legislation, of course, has risks. Our normal process for a bill is that all of them are referred to a parliamentary committee for 6 months to hear public submissions, to scrutinise the bill and to try and improve it. Where that's bypassed, there are some dangers. And one of the bills that was passed, there was a COVID-19 response bill passed through all stages of the House on one day, that without the knowledge of members established a small business loan scheme, essentially by accident. It had been something that was in an earlier draft of the bill. It was not in the copy of the bill circulated to other parties for consultation, but was in the copy that was introduced on the floor of the House and on the table of the House. And so ultimately was the one that was passed. Members didn't, for the most part, find out they'd done that until after it was passed. And so, I mean, that is a really serious warning about passing things probably too quickly, or perhaps them not getting the level of scrutiny they needed. It was a human error. There was no intentional deceit involved. But you know, I guess it's a warning that you can put good systems in place, you can cooperate and do things quickly, but it's still possible to make significant mistakes. So this loan scheme is still operating. As I said, most bills in New Zealand go to a committee for 6 months. Sometimes for emergency legislation, whether it's related to the pandemic or not, it goes through much faster, but the Parliament usually tries to put bills in front of a committee, even if it's just for a week, to hear expert evidence and to improve the legislation. And I think a good example is the emergency changes to our firearms legislation following the terrorist attacks on mosques in New Zealand on the 15th of March last year. Within the space of a week, the Parliament outlawed a variety of weapons that have been used in these murders. And even in that case, where there was a high degree of urgency and strong public feeling, those bills went to a committee for a week for some scrutiny. So I think one lesson would be that even if you only have a short time, a bill having time with a small group of people where they can scrutinise it in detail is really worthwhile. The final thing I mention is the model in New Zealand was the government, under emergency management legislation, public health legislation, was able to exercise emergency powers without needing further authority of the Parliament. And it could make orders that in an emergency, in an epidemic, that had been authorised by primary legislation, but without further reference to the House. And so one of the things the Parliament did was to establish some mechanisms for scrutinising these things. And while they recognise the executive is best placed to act in an emergency, they also recognise that parliamentary scrutiny was important. And so the orders that were made around public health were subject to scrutiny by our secondary legislation committee called the Regulations Review Committee. These orders could only be approved or extended after the committee had scrutinised them and reported on them, or the time for it to do that had passed if it chose not to. And that was quite an important break, I think, on unchecked executive authority. It was scrutiny and approval. In some instances, the House, because it supported these things, approved them unanimously without that scrutiny, but that would have not been possible if parties hadn't supported it. In declaring a state of emergency, ministers had to report that to the House as well. While the House wasn't sitting, we came up with a new method of doing that to make sure members knew about it anyway. So I think from the New Zealand experience, parliaments need to be able to make rapid changes in times like this. And I think for us, we don't have a codified constitution, which can make these things a lot faster. We're a unicameral parliament as well, and we have a small number of members, 120. And usually 5 or 6 parties in our parliament. So it's relatively easy, if there's the will, to make changes quite quickly. And that needed to be done because we went into lockdown within the space of 24 hours. It worked, as I say, because the opposition supported what was happening. Scrutiny of legislation, when it's being expedited in a day or two, is incredibly important. And I hope the example I gave is a good reminder of the need to really focus on the detail of it, even when it's passing through very quickly and even when everyone supports it. Even a short amount of time of committee consideration, I think, is always worthwhile. And then I think finally, if there are going to be powers exercised in an emergency, it's really important to think about what sort of parliamentary oversight there will be. That might not necessarily be approval of everything. The executive is there to act after all. But I think there's definitely a role for Parliament in testing how well those things are going and, if necessary, putting some checks on them. So that's just a very quick overview of what's been happening in New Zealand. I look forward to answering any questions about it later, but just conscious of time, I'll finish there and pass back to Shamoon.